tere päevast, minu nimi on Aleksander Eeri ja vaatate Fotografiska jutusid. Tänane külaline taas eesti keelt räägib küll, kuid otsustame siiski kõneleda temaga inglise keeles, nii et Steve Kokker, welcome.
Tervis, hello, welcome.
Very nice to meet you once again. First off, where were you born and what year were you born?
Okay, we start directly
Yes.
with this. Yes, I was born in Montreal, in the province of Quebec, Canada, in 1965, August.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
And what first got you interested in Andy Warhol?
Andy Warhol, I was a big cinema buff since I was about 6 or 7 years old. I was just watching movies a lot, possibly because I was an only child, but I just like really cued into an imaginary life through movies. So on TV or going to cinemas. And around about sometime in my teen years, I would be reading lots of books about all kinds of movie cinemas, and what really attracted to me was independent cinema or international cinema. And so I'd come across the word Andy Warhol. I vaguely knew of him as a rather, to me, uninteresting pop artist. I wasn't so interested in the big famous Marilyns, Elvises and Campbell soup cans, or they didn't speak to me. But then I read about his lifestyle, what they called the factory, his big studio where people gathered and where he did his art and where all sorts of interesting underground personalities would gather, and also did films. And so these films had been taken out of circulation actually from the very early 70s up till starting late 80s, but mainly mid-late 90s. They were completely like unavailable to be seen. So I would read about these weird, fascinating characters and descriptions of the films from some people who had seen them then, and somehow it started a whole kind of imagination of like of these odd characters that he would assemble, the strange, semi-illegal, salacious things that they would do in this factory, and how he would go about filming them. And because I've always been quite attracted to documentary films, even as a kid, and observing people. I think this to me was the big factor that cued me into Andy Warhol, because the films just seemed to be statically, positioned cameras that would just film until the film went out, and almost, no editing for the first 3-4 years. His films were all basically like this, and he just positioned people in front of the camera and let them do their thing. And this to me was really fascinating. It went against everything that it seemed cinema was about, all the artifice and the acting and the drama, which is also nice. But this seemed to me to really be a way to capture people behind the masks that we all wear socially. So he did about 500 short films called screen tests, and these to me were the most interesting things that I'd heard. That they were all silent, and he would just position people in front of the camera, give them minimal instructions, like just look into the camera and then sort of walk out of the room, or would change the film every 3 minutes. But basically left them alone in the room to stare in front of a camera for sometimes up to like half an hour, sometimes just a few minutes. And from the descriptions of these and the pictures, the stills that I saw, and the kind of rawness in people's eyes, that really left a deep impression on me. Partially because I'd already been just, I don't know exactly why, but super just fascinated in human behaviors. And one of the earliest memories I have at all, and I was probably 4 or 5 years old, I would used to take the public bus with my grandmother, and I would insist that we play a game where I would try to guess what different people on the bus would do in their lives, or where they were coming from and where they were going to. And so I would just say like, she's a teacher at a kindergarten and she's going home now after school and her daughter is waiting for her, and whatever. And my grandmother would patiently listen, yes dear, and I would just look at these people. And I'm not really sure, at some point in primary school I used to wonder, like, maybe I'm like an alien or something who's just here to observe people, or something like this. I always felt myself a bit of an outsider, even, or maybe especially at primary school. Elementary school, and so just sort of slightly looking at people or the world from a side. And then when I read more about Warhol, his films and him in general, that something in that really clicked. And so inspired by these films I'd never even seen, I actually started videotaping friends, very similarly, friends and family members. I would make them very uncomfortable by asking them to to sit in a room alone with a video going for maybe 5-10 minutes and walk out of the room, and then have these kind of living portraits ultimately.
And by saying that inspired by those films that you hadn't really seen, how did you find out that those existed? And once you found out that they existed, did you just had like a synopsis of them basically, or you got to know that okay, this is what he did, but you'd never really, because they weren't available at that time, so you were just inspired by the fact that you knew that this is what he did.
I think this is a big part of my early connection with Andy Warhol before I'd seen any of the films, because eventually I would then go to New York quite a lot in the early and mid 90s, and where I met some of the people involved in the factory eventually, and when I was a film critic at the time, so I had kind of credentials to do that. But before that, it would just be from books and developing almost a bit of a kind of like an imagination about this world of Warhol and what happened there with all of the actors and the hustlers, the prostitutes and the rock stars and the drug addicts and the disco club life, people who would sort of hang out there and be filmed and photographed by him as well. So I think just by reading so much, I developed a bit of an imagination, saw stills from that, and was just inspired. And there were some people talking about his technique or lack of it, of just filming what was there, that I found immediately was really interesting. So sometimes I would just place a camera in a school cafeteria or something and film long shots, because I also saw that people tend to be what I would call like a kind of real or pure when they were at rest, not engaged in social conversation or doing something. There was always, it seemed like a little bit of acting, which is fine, but then suddenly I would just see when the friends went away and somebody was left alone eating a sandwich or something, somehow the facial expressions there were like, seemed a lot more raw, and this is what Warhol seemed to capture in some of these films as well.
And what age was that? Middle school, high school?
That was starting in high school into college and university.
Okay, so you were still a young person, but did you have like a similar scene in Montreal, or was that you had a similar underground scene and you were like, oh, these people are like us or we are like them, or was it that your life was so completely different that this was something like, wow, like a mecca?
Yeah, I think it was more that latter bit. I think partially because I kind of grew up feeling different than the people around me. Either my interest seems to be different. I was aware also that I was more attracted to men than women, which I knew was normal, but also not considered like part of mainstream. I was quite quiet and shy. I had quite red hair. A bunch of things just made me feel like different than the rest, probably. Like I think many people feel themselves to be a bit that way, but. Growing up, I kind of also, I went to a private boys' school and was like, fairly conservative. I looked a bit like with my red hair and like a kind of an apple pie face, very kind of innocent and pure. And I was like quite like a good boy, in many ways. But I think part of me was always like, searching for what I considered to be the opposite, or at least curious about other ways of being, or at least feeling that inside I may have other interests and impulses that maybe don't correlate with the surface. So I would, as a teenager, listen to live broadcasts on the radio, for example, of the discotheques downtown on Friday nights, and stay up really late and listen to all the disco music and things, and just imagine like, what are these people doing in these clubs? Like, it sounds like, and just dancing, and there's all this kind of imagination. And so I think with the Warhol scene, it seemed to be like a whole alternate world that he created with these people, and so I think I was very attracted to people who seemed to be quite different to me on the surface.
And in college you studied psychology, right?
Yeah.
Yes. So from that perspective, looking at those films of Andy Warhol, what would you say as a psychologist or as somebody who studies psychology, what was he doing? What was like the impulse behind that? Or is he trying to find out something about humans? Is he trying to show something about himself? Like what is the machine or what's the energy behind that creation?
That's a really big enigma about him, because although there's a small library of books and documentaries now have been made about him, but still there's no capturing any human essence really in through analysis. But it seemed to me that he also had this kind of feeling of being an outsider, never completely accepted, even though he became extremely famous during his lifetime and would be paid so much money and attention. He grew up feeling really awkward, ugly, unattractive, teased in Pittsburgh. He grew up looking very oddly. He knew he was attracted to men. Lived ultimately even in New York when he moved there with his mother, who seemed like extreme devout Catholic, kind of strange person who never spoke English in her life. So I think when he was suddenly surrounded by these people and had an opportunity to kind of investigate them, he wasn't really into psychoanalysis or anything like this. He was quite into what the surface representation of a human or an object would say about their inner essence. So it's hard to know what drew him to that. I could just say, more personally, it seemed to connect with what I was kind of interested in, just observing human nature. Partially, it's always a search for the self as well, a search for an understanding of the self when you're kind of trying to, people who go into psychology are famously cliched, trying to figure themselves out or interested in themselves ultimately, because it's the ultimate puzzle. But, so yeah.
When was the first time you went to New York?
I was given a ticket by my mom on my 18th birthday. And so I went again with my red hair and like super innocent eyes, and I was just completely like, what's going on here? But I knew it was very, very interesting. And then eventually I started to go by myself. It's only a 6-hour bus ride from Montreal, so I started to go many times a year. It became almost like my alternate life. At first I would just hit all of the galleries and museums and bookstores and just sort of like soak in cultural references or history of the city, but also it's such a cosmopolitan city. So I in some ways I was kind of educating myself more in the arts, cinema as well. And then as I became a journalist and film critic back in Montreal, then my trips to New York became more deeper in terms of investigating film history. So I would hit all of the bookstores and any kind of exhibits. And then eventually, like, because it was the city of Andy Warhol, I started, and I can't remember exactly how, but like, especially in those days without internet and stuff, but like, I met up with a number of people from the factory or from his films, on the kind of pretext of doing an interview and an interview article, which I did in some cases, but it was more to just meet these super freaky people who were still hanging out in New York City, and was able to do that.
Beautiful. How did you become a film critic?
How does one become a film? I kind of stumbled into it. What happened, I had got a couple of degrees in psychology and social work, and worked for a few years as a counselor with schizophrenics and manic depressives and bipolar people in what's called halfway houses, where they're released from the hospital and live in semi-independent living. But all the while, this passion for cinema had continued, and so basically in my free time, going to films and studying about films was a main passion. And writing, I'd been also writing stories and diaries and things since I was also like 6 years old was my first little story, if we could call it that. And so I had a real urge to write about cinema, and I just contacted our local independent newspaper that I was reading anyway, and asked if they happened to need any extra help, or occasionally just to try it out, and they did. And so I did that, started just free and kind of as a hobby, and didn't think it was going to go very much, but I kept getting more and more requests for longer articles and things, and saw that I could actually make a living with this, and that was really in line with these two passions at the time, which was writing and cinema.
I'm gonna come back to that, but because you mentioned working with schizophrenics and manic depressive people, what did you learn from that? What did you learn from those people?
Oh, so much foundational sense of being human. I think, well, let's say one of the many things would be that there's very, very little difference between us and them. So the people that we call sane / relatively sane, and the ones that we think should be, living somewhere else, because it just sort of seemed to me that, for example, in a paranoid schizophrenic case, where they might really be very convinced that they saw the same car, for example, several times in the last few days following them, or that they keep passing the same color or something like this, and so they were walking home and they saw this, and it's like quite significant. The rational mind, listens to this and pushes it away, that it's quite obvious that it's either a coincidence or, but actually almost everybody has at least a microsecond of some kind of connection like that, some kind of impulse thought like that, like, I saw that number twice already today, or searching for meaning. We're meaning-making machines, and sometimes we'll ascribe significance to things that may be quite random. But this thought at first, for example, it's as if somebody's following me. We actually get that, but then very, very quickly screen it out and so, well, no, everything's fine. But they just don't have those screens. And actually one really interesting definition of schizophrenia is just a lack of filters, which I've always loved, because it just means that we have the luck and ability to filter out a lot of existence and stimulation, because if I was to really sense even in this quiet space, all of the oral and visual stimulation, it would actually, I'd go crazy. So I need to filter it out and dull it out. So this continuum aspect of what we call sanity was really powerful for me at the time. I was like 20 or something, but
This is so interesting, because I've had basically exactly the same experience. I want to mention two things. I used to do children's theater, so theater for children, so travel around the country and do plays for kindergarteners and school children. And one time during the Christmas time, I'd had very little sleep, because sometimes we had to drive for hours, so we had to get up like 3 or 4 a.m. in the morning to get to the right place. And we were doing a play for disabled children, mentally disabled children, like they had their own school. And up until that time, I'd had the belief that there are normal people and then there are crazy people, right? But I was so sleep deprived, and I was behind the stage waiting for everybody to get there. And they were all making noises. They all looked a bit different. They had all very uninhibited, if you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. And for the first time in my life, I realized that I'm exactly like them. And there isn't like a wall separating us, but again, there is this continuum or this spectrum, and we all fall there somewhere, but change a person just a tiny bit, and again, we're all exactly the same things. And the same thing you mentioned about schizophrenia, because I've seen many close people struggling with different problems. And again, something that I realized was that if I look at myself, my own thoughts or thoughts of other people who are quote unquote normal, then just as you said, we all have so many different ideas, feelings, thoughts, whatever, but the only thing that separates us from being strange or like needing help is that we don't believe everything that we think. We all have those strange thoughts, but the only thing is like, oh, that's a strange thought, and then you go on with your life.
Yeah.
But with those people, again, what I feel so oftentimes is just they don't have like a mechanism of understanding, like, yes, I'm having this thought, yes, I saw this, but that doesn't mean X, Y, or Z. It could just mean whatever. It's very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of us would benefit from a little bit more down the spectrum, because it also opens the gates to creative thinking and making connections that are more free floating and free associating, which is like a foundational source of creativity. The more we learn to put things in boxes, or, oh no, that's not relevant, or there's no symbolism in that, or what am I thinking? So what if I see the number 12 3 times in a day? It doesn't matter. But actually, if we go too far, then we become disabled to get our work done, because we might just be completely overwhelmed by this. But a little bit could say, okay, probably it doesn't mean anything that I saw 12 3 times a day, but if it did, what would it be? And then you start to be able to think, see yourself through a little slightly different perspectives and this kind of thing, as opposed to like, oh, get on with A, B, C, D, and I'm very busy. So a little bit would actually be beautiful.
I'm going to change topics back now to the film criticism part. Like, what makes a good film critic? This is something like, it might be just a very broad brush question, because I don't know what I'm trying to ask, but it's many people have criticisms of film critics because they're like, who are you? What are you doing? You don't know how to do it yourself, and then you're just like coming up whether something is good, bad, whatever. Like, how did you approach it? First question, and then like, what is the role or the duty of a film critic? What are you, because you're not just supposed to tell me like what happens in a movie, but you're supposed to tell me something else, but what is it?
Yeah. I kind of learned through the process of this, but I think, so some percentage would be a foundational base knowledge about cinema, like to some degree. Doesn't have to be a PhD in it, but some ability to contextualize what you're seeing into like put it into a larger context, more just like I liked it, I didn't like it or something, but like to see maybe where it fits into that genre in the history or of the cultural context or something like this. So there's work and education and some understanding about the basics of cinematography and lighting, acting, so that you can have some reference points to be able to even pass any kind of reflection. But I think the majority of it, and what I always try to do, is to offer a personalized reflection of my reaction to this cinema, to this film. So there's part of it that's explaining a bit about because the reader doesn't always so much care, what does Steve feel about this, or partially actually they do, and that's what will connect with them if they can get something personal. But they also kind of are thinking, should I go or not? But kind of they want to know. So to give enough context of the film to help them be able to answer that question, is this a film that's worth my time or not? But I think what's interesting is sort of like this film experience filtered through my personality and understanding of cinema, reflected back through words, so that they can sort of have this connect to perhaps my experience of the film, which would give them a lot more. Because if you, well, it's like anything. If I ask you how your meal was or something, you can define precisely what it was and all the ingredients and how much it cost and where was it and how the lighting was and this kind of thing, and it might give me some like that resonates or not. But the moment you start saying how it was for you, even if actually I'm not interested at all in the food that you're talking about. Maybe I don't even like, or I think I don't like what you're talking about. But your experience of it, I'm kind of hooked. And so I really tried to offer that without also being like too, getting into my personal story or something, but to make it personal and not to sound definitive, like this film is this or anything like that, because that's always an illusion.
So looking at through that perspective, the films of Andy Warhol, what did he do? What's the cultural significance, if any? How should we, who are not film critics, who are not well versed in the history of film or history of art, how should we see them?
With great curiosity and an open mind. Well, that's actually a really big question, so I'll try to summarize. First of all, the films of Andy Warhol, even that, in a sense, it means many things to many people. It seems like really him behind the camera, turning the camera on and off, kind of happened in the first few years, like from 63 to 65, 6 or so. And after that, he got less directly involved in making the films. And there was another guy there named Paul Morrissey, who actually was the main director for the ones that we now consider the films of Andy Warhol. So even some of Chelsea Girls and the Flesh Trash, Heat, the Blood, Dracula and Frankenstein movies, and a number of other ones, Lonesome Cowboys. These were all filmed by somebody else, and in some cases Warhol just gave his name to put on the poster, kind of, or semi-produced it, and in other cases he was more involved. So he just used film basically as a medium, one of many mediums, because he'd used silk screen and photography and Polaroid photography and art and the interviews, also text, like he founded Interview magazine, and all of these different mediums. In a way, he was kind of like a pop art renaissance man in that way, was to kind of uncover or expose people in their natural state. Like I think a lot of, so it was just a medium for that. So to approach his films as films is a very interesting process, because they're not cinema. His stuff was not edited at all. No sound in the first years. So, but it's also really fascinating to see what he did with the potential of that medium to uncover real personalities, to go beyond the mask, instead of just well, not just, but Hollywood cinema, or most films would be heavily scripted and with stories and storyboarded and this kind of thing. And he went against all of that and still came up with something that's ultimately quite compelling, even though for most viewers they were very, very boring. There's films that would last hours. For example, his first main one was Sleep, which was 5 hours of a guy sleeping in different positions, for example. But what's ultimately fascinating for me about the films like Sleep, or there's a number of other ones where you're watching, and even watching a face for 30 minutes is a challenging thing, especially now. But what happens, what's really beautiful, and what cues into, I think, something else I really liked in there, is that the smallest tiny things that happen, for example, an eyebrow going up or somebody sniffing or something like this, suddenly within the context of that film, which can be a bit tired, like, okay, do I need to see everything? Suddenly some little thing happens that normally is completely inconsequential and uninteresting, but within the context it becomes monumental and significant, and it trains your brain to actually focus on the small details that we just toss away as insignificant or uninteresting, and that opens up a real appreciation to life itself, I think, in the small details of things. So to be able to appreciate what he also called the landscape of the human body, for example, in its micro movements, or in the way shadows fall over certain parts of the body, or in some giveaways that another mask is falling by the way eyes squint or something like this. to me, these were monumental things.
That's very interesting, because before we started filming, you mentioned Vipassana, and what you said right now about within the context of something that is, let's say, boring, then something very small can become very interesting all of a sudden. And I feel like, as much I've heard other people who have visited Vipassana retreats basically say the same thing, that if you stay silent and not talking, not looking people into their eyes for 10 days straight, then all of a sudden, every sunset, every gust of wind, every small gesture becomes so much more beautiful and important, because it becomes filled with life, because you have this contrast of not being constantly stimulated all the time. Yeah.
And in that, I think, is life itself. There's a quote in the tea world. There's a quote about a Japanese author, and it's probably one of my favorite quotes. It's something like, those who are incapable of seeing the smallness of great things cannot appreciate the greatness in small things. So finding greatness in the small details that are usually not even seen, whereas we tend to focus on relatively insignificant or minor things and call them great, and focus a lot on the big movements, on the big gestures, on the fabulous moments, for example. And this is an invitation to completely throw all that away and find momentous beauty of potentially emotional significance in a facial expression, or a little twitch, or in some beautiful detail. So.
Was that something that you always had an intuition for, or did a mindset like this grow on you as you've aged?
I think there was definitely something always there, certainly not formulated in anything like this, like I say, even in my teenage years, but maybe because some people know me as quite a typical Virgo, Neitzi, so quite detail-oriented, so maybe there was something in kind of the way I tend to approach life, and like looking at small details and thinking about numbers. I again, didn't have brothers and sisters, so yeah, my interest was in cinema and music. I mean, I had thousands of albums at some point, and I would just sit for hours, like thousands of hours probably, just sitting and really listening to music. Both my grandparents were also musicians, my Estonian grandparents, so possibly also through them, just like listening for the tiniest little sounds and things. So I think somehow, without understanding it, I probably trained my brain a little bit to just notice small details, and then at some point that transferred into kind of human behavior or something.
Was the knowledge of psychology something that when either looking at films or being fascinated by somebody like Andy Warhol, seeing his work, is that something that you have to try to switch off, to not try to like psychoanalyze everything or everyone that you see, or is it something that has helped you, being a film critic, for example?
Ideally, it would be chronologically both. So there's definitely a period that you'd go and just psychoanalyze everything, and sort of like, which is extremely boring and for everybody involved, and usually complete bullshit, really, because because you're attempting to categorize and imprison people by your own very certain understandings of what they are and what box they should be placed in, or something like this. So it's a really, again, it's a matter of degree. A little bit there, and you might open a possibility to understand a person in a way that they haven't been understood before, or to see somebody and reflect back to them aspects of themselves that they haven't really been before. But if it's just for the process of analyzing, which I think it was definitely for a while, or as an intellectual exercise, which it's a horrible thing to do to another person, but combined with perspective, compassion, and not being super certain about what you think, then you can allow an opportunity for somebody actually to step into themselves a bit. So it's a bit of both.
Steve, you mentioned that your grandparents are from Estonia, but you were born in Canada. How did you end up back here?
Well, back here is an interesting term, actually, and a lot of people have used it over the years. And at first I was like, well, it's not back here. I was never born, so it's not technically back. But then again, I would think, well, wait a minute. Again, the same thing that we were talking about. It's like, technically, no, this is not back because I was born in Canada. But if I allow a little bit of symbol to go in along this spectrum, continuum that we were speaking about, then in what way is it back? And probably there is a way, because it's always felt a bit of a question of status, fate, fortune, that I'm actually back here. So I think at the beginning it was just simple curiosity that both my grandparents died just before 1991, so they didn't live to see Estonia become independent again, and they never thought it would. And at the time growing up, I was always kind of interested, as much as a kid would be, but and they wanted me to go to Estonian school in Montreal when I was 7 or 8 on the weekends, and I was like, not interested, sorry. Unfortunately, maybe then I would have had a better sense of this unfathomable thing that you call grammar. But I'd see pictures and I would hear them speaking, and so there was some kind of closeness to me, but basically it was kind of Russia and dark and very, very far and quite impossible and stuff. Then it opened, and I was also growing up and able to travel, and I was planning a trip to Europe, and I kind of just thought, actually it was a friend of mine who lived in Sweden who said, oh, there's a boat every day that goes to Stockholm, and somehow I thought, what, a boat? That you can actually go to this country? Where is it? Really quite clueless a bit. And so I thought, well, I suppose I should go and see what it was like. And it was 1992 actually, and it was a week after the krone was introduced, and I was just here a week. But it was, night and day from anything that resembling now, of course. But I was transfixed and hooked. It was like no other country I'd ever been to. Plus, everyone was speaking the language of these grandparents who I really loved very much. And although I didn't think in this way very much at the time, I really heard a voice telling me, "You're home." I remember I was somewhere on Vabaduse Väljak or something, and somewhere in the old town, and I kind of heard as if a voice, and I wasn't. Now I'm a bit more kind of esoteric as a person, but I didn't really think in that way at the time, but it was so strong that I found myself answering, looking around me and going, I don't think so. No, this is not home. This very different place. It's interesting, but it's not. It's so different at the time. But ultimately that voice was true. I guess I fought against it for a while. I visited here in St. Petersburg that first time, just a week each, and then came back a year later and stayed a few months, and came back a year later and stayed a few months, and came back a year later, and this slowly my life kind of started to grow here, and I was visiting Russia a lot, and my life back in Canada as a film critic, but I felt like I'm staying in this position too long. I'm no longer really enjoying it, and so I just thought I'll come here, Estonia, for 6 months, and just 6 months, because of course I'm not going to move here, but I'll just come here for 6 months, and take some time off and enjoy and get to know the country, and basically I'm still here since.
Okay, and how did you find your way from films and from that previous life, from music, to tea and bodywork?
Well, before that was another transition, which was an amalgamation of writing and travel. So as I started to travel more, basically basing myself here, and I was still always interested in writing, I at some point decided, okay, I don't really feel like going back to Canada, so I'm going to stay here for a bit longer. Not sure how, but how can I stay here and get some kind of job? And I became a travel writer. So I wrote for The Lonely Planet, a series of publications, for about 7 years, and was traveling a lot in this area and in Russia a lot, and was writing guidebooks. So that kept me here. And then when that was coming to an end, and I still found after 7 years, I don't really want to go back to Canada. I'm pretty established and rooted here. But I'm feeling this is coming to an end. What am I going to do now? By that time, tea had come into my life as a main interest and passion and a bit nerdy intellectual pursuit, and as well as like a personal habit and hobby. And so I thought, why don't I try to do something like that in Estonia? Because at the time it was like 2004. I started importing teas here. There was very little choice, and I kept complaining how like shit the tea selection here, but in Riga and St. Petersburg they have tea salons in there, but Tallinn has nothing. And then I kind of heard myself complaining one day again, and just say like, well, would you just shut up then and do it yourself, or do something yourself? So I started an attempt at being a businessman, which is still being attempted to this day. So I just started slowly importing better teas, and got contacts in Germany, and went to China, and one by one started selling teas to restaurants and hotels and various things, and just sort of grew from there. And now there's a shop, and it's quite a big infrastructure. And then massage, I was always kind of also interested in, well, not always actually, I don't know, like I took my first massage course in 1998, and that was also a bit of a random thing I just did with a friend, because I was suggesting that he does this, and he said, well, hey, if you're going to make me go do this, you come with me as well. And I thought, okay. But that grew into a very serious hobby for me. So basically, I've never stopped taking various kinds of bodywork and massage courses all the way, but all this time, but kind of relegating it most of the time to just hobbies or things I would offer to friends, or a way of communication, nonverbal communication. But that has developed a lot more as well, and now it's to the point where, yeah, I'm kind of I do more of that actually than my tea life, I suppose.
So for me, those two things have to do with something that I feel in our country and in the Western world in general we have big problems with. First one with tea, it's slowing down, which I feel is very important, which we don't do enough. And the second one with body is that human beings, especially men in our country and in our world, are not very much in contact with our bodies. We're very cut off from our emotions. Are those two things that I mentioned something that you have also felt, that have also been a reason why you do those things? Or is it just that for whatever reason you like tea and you like body work, and the things that I mentioned don't seem that important to you?
Yeah, they're completely irrelevant, and I can't understand why you're asking me these kind of questions. For heaven's sakes. No, they're very, very on target, and I think there are things that I kind of realized later on, because for a number of years it was kind of in my head like, I like tea very much, and I like bodywork and like massage very much. And for a few years I was thinking, how can I possibly integrate these two very separate things like into my life? Like, they're very important to me, but like, how do they go together? And actually, I mean, ultimately I can see that they both emerge from a similar source, which is one of silence, or as much silence as I can cultivate, and one that encourages silence / slowing down / noticing these moments and these details and things that the mind is not very interested in consciously. So for me, they're very similar expressions actually of a same source, even though they might look very, very differently. And the embodiment aspect that also came, I would say, only in the last 10 years that I had kind of an understanding of that, because I focused a lot on on technique and relaxation and method of nonverbal communication and a kind of muscular approach to the body, and could notice that small miracles would be taking place, even from just like foot massage accompanied by a talk, for example, or just incorporating casual touch into a talk, but never quite connected what was going on. But now I absolutely see that there's so much lack of understanding about the body, but also a disconnection with the body. And I'm really heartened to hear a lot of people being able to put that into words. People who come to me will actually now in the last few years be able to say that I don't feel a connection with some parts of my body, for example. And so sometimes body work doesn't have to look like a massage. It can be just helping a person understand their corporality, like their physical selves, and in doing so, of course, deepen their experience as full human beings.
What would you say to a man, a male, who feels uncomfortable being touched by another man? And I mean that in a non-sexual way, because there are very many men like that in the Western world, in Estonia especially, who feel like, I'm a tough guy, I'm so free, I'm my own man, I do my own decisions. But if you ask them to like raise their hands above their heads and shake their hips, they fall apart, they can't do it. They're too afraid. If you ask like, can you get a massage from another man, if you're like very tense and sick and whatever, they can't, they won't. There is an acquaintance, let's say, who a friend of my father's, who had a specific issue with a specific part of his body, and because he feels it's a private part of his body, he wasn't willing to go to a doctor, and he basically said that if it should ever go that bad that I need to go to a doctor, then I have a gun to take care of that problem. Basically meaning he would rather kill himself than let another man, not absolutely non-sexually, touch him physically.
Well, that's very powerful. Well, you've also threw a dart kind of at the center of a lot of what we've actually spoken about, because especially now, but already for many years, well, a majority of my clientele are men, and so I actually work a lot more with men, but not exclusively. But what I started noticing, even before I was quite aware of what was going on, but just the fact that I've, well, the fact that I said I'm more attracted to men, so that's like brought me close in contact into men, but I tended actually not to identify too much with the gay community or something. So I've actually, from high school on, I don't know why, but I've been kind of like drawn to, and a mutual drawing to, you know, heterosexually identified men. And so there was a lot of time of like either friction or some kind of like interesting contrast in these relationships and things. And for a long time I just was nervous or didn't understand much about it. But over the years I've seen, I mean now in the hundreds of times, some real deep beauty and deep relaxation when a guy can let himself be touched, admired, hugged, massaged, something like this, and it can be a completely non-erotic or non-sexual way, but intimate always. It's always there's an intimacy, but together with safety, a feeling of safety, comfort, and non-expectation. And how healing that is. I mean, and it's sad for me to think that I'm actually pretty rare to have seen so many examples of this in my life, because these same people have, you know, many times who've never touched their own friends like this, maybe have a real need to be approached in this way, but unfortunately society doesn't make it easier, doesn't give scripts for men to follow to be able to touch in this way. So now people come to me for this, and still have my friends with whom I'm like quite kind of like touchy, you know, not always with everyone, depends. But I also am able to, I do workshops, for example, and do some workshops in festivals like Tantra Festival in Sweden, for example, where I lead some workshops just a few hours long, but for like brotherly touch, I call it, like platonic, intimate touch for men, something like this. And I make it very fun and things like this, because then there's always like whether it's 20 or 70 very nervous looking guys come in from all ages, like, and really like sometimes telling me before, I think I'm going to have to leave this workshop, it will be intense for me because maybe they've been abused, which happens a lot, unfortunately, or they're just, you know, homophobic for most of their lives, or they have something and I think I'm going to need to leave. And by the end they're like little puppies, like allowed to just share physical space. So it's a huge need, I think, for most people. I also don't necessarily think everybody must have this kind of relationship, but and so what would I say? It's tough question. I would not impose anything on anybody who's not ready for something. If somebody comes and says that they're very uncomfortable about this, but they're sick and tired of being uncomfortable about it, which I hear a lot, or that I have these friends and I don't even feel I can give them a hug or cuddle or something with them, what can I do? Then I would either, through talking, explore what they might feel safe in exploring, or just give some tips on how to incorporate casual touch. But I think it's the potential for, quote unquote healing, or if we could just say a more balanced living out of one's masculine self, is massive with incorporating touch. I think if touch is completely left out, just like, we're not full beings if we let that out.
Yeah, I feel like in our society, one of the reasons why men love sports is because it's one of the ways where you can get non-sexual, non-erotic, physical touch, which is, again, it's actually a very masculine thing to touch your brothers and your friends and so on. It's very primitive in the best kind of sense. It's very it's what warriors and soldiers and so on have always done, but we're lacking it. So we get it through sports, and people who don't get it through sports, I find, either get it through violence.
Yeah,
I know I've met many men in my life, young men my age, older, much older, who have the need to get absolutely drunk and start fights, because through fighting you get that physical closeness.
Right.
And if you don't do neither of them, then usually we have men who have a lot of pent up anger, and they get like random diseases that come out of nowhere.
Absolutely.
But actually it's like 30 years of suppressed needs
and mistrust for other men too.
Yeah.
There's huge lack of trust on the part of men towards other men.
Yeah, but it's always connected to like believing that if another man touches me in a non-erotic way and I find like comfort or solace or anything like that, that means something about me.
Yes.
That means that I am X, Y, Z. And it's such a toxic mindset that I really hope that we can grow past that in the coming years.
Yeah.
I have time for a few more questions. First of all, the motto of Fotografiska is inspiring a more conscious world. What do you feel inspires a more conscious world? How can we, how can you, how can the viewer inspire a more conscious world, or create a more conscious world?
I guess first thing that comes to mind is taking care of the self enough to give some alone time to yourself every once in a while. So to nourish this kind of inner silence or inner peace that sometimes seems very far away from the monkey mind, but that it's really there. So whether it's through some kind of meditative practice or even a jog in the forest, sometimes some way to actively nourish that space, because I think ultimately everything starts from there. So there could be a whole list of answers to the question, but if you don't feed that essential foundational aspect of our nature, that most of society does not want you to feed this, or it's very uninteresting to do so, that you can't really step much further.
Beautiful. Have you had anything important values, important beliefs that you've changed your mind about over the course of the past 5, 10, 15, 20 years?
Yeah, probably so many things. So many things that I was certain about throughout my life has, like, time and time again been shown with humor, irony, compassion, and sometimes a slap across the face, to be just sort of like, ha ha ha, and you thought this. Yeah, I could just pick one of just being certain. That's even that incredibly powerful feeling of certainty that we get many times throughout the day, that either my opinion is correct about something, or the world is the way, or should be a certain way. It's almost never that way, and so yeah, the more alternate perspectives we can have on things, the more that is softened up. So yeah, I would probably say that's that's like a really critical one, this letting go of this certainty of life.
Wonderful. So you have the Chado tea shop. We didn't mention it. We kind of walked around it, but you have the Chado tea shop. So if anybody is interested in fine tea, they can find you in Old Town, I know, right?
Yeah, it's on Uus 11. Uus 11. We have the best staff in Tallinn, I'm pretty sure.
Beautiful, and also the best art on the windows.
Yes.
By a great childhood friend of mine.
Yes, yeah,
yes.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you wanna say, leave people with before we start? No, we're not gonna start. We're gonna stop.
Well, every start is a new beginning, and the ending is a new beginning. Well, to read a bit more of my philosophy about tea and touch, I have a website called teaandtouch.com. That would be one thing, and yeah, mostly really thank you for your presence and your awareness, and for your ability to create a space into which other people can step out into, which is one thing I really admired about Warhol as a kind of a character. He created space in which people felt comfortable to be themselves, and I think it's an important aspect of an interviewer as well. And so you've just done that with me today, and that's a great pleasure.
Thank you very much, Steve Kokker.
Thanks.
Suur aitäh kõikidele vaatamast ja kohtume juba järgmine kord. Aitäh!